There is a detail in Genesis that archaeologists have been trying to explain for decades without fully succeeding. It is not modern speculation or a marginal theory. It is a fact that appears documented in 3 distinct sources. The Book of Enoch, cited directly by Jude, brother of Jesus, describes events that precede the flood of Noah, and those events coincide with disturbing precision with the oldest legends that humanity has preserved, civilizations that never met, that never traded with each other, that did not even know the others existed. All of them described exactly the same being, half woman, half something that did not belong to this world, a creature of supernatural beauty, with a voice capable of annulling the will of any adult man, always connected with water, always dangerous, always feminine, always remembered with a mixture of terror and fascination. We are not talking about minor variations or superficial coincidences. We are talking about specific details that are repeated without exception. The same shape, the same power, the same relationship with water, the same effect on the men who approached them. The Greeks called them sirens, the West Africans mamiwata, the Babylonians sculpted them in their temples, the Slavs feared them as rusalki. The Japanese wrote about the Ningyo in texts more than 1,000 years old. And the question that no academic has been able to answer satisfactorily is this: why are they all the same? Why did cultures separated by oceans and millennia all arrive at the same description with the same details? There are 2 ways to answer that question, and the second is the one we are going to explore today with all the seriousness it deserves. It could be a coincidence resulting from human collective psychology and the power of the universal archetype. Or it could be that all those cultures were remembering the same thing, preserving the echo of a real event. An event so shocking, so disturbing to the order of creation, that God himself had to intervene to erase it. It is not a minor chapter or an obscure passage. It is the context that makes the flood have a meaning that goes beyond the moral. Because that is precisely what Genesis describes. Although most readers overlook it. Open Genesis at chapter 6, and in the first 4 verses you will find something that does not fit the rest of the text. The Bible does not arrive directly at Noah, at the ark and the flood. There is something before, something that the verses mention as if it were known. Genesis 6:1-4 says that when men began to multiply on the face of the earth and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful, and they took wives for themselves, choosing among all of them. And then verse 4, one of the most debated in all the Bible: there were giants on the earth in those days. And also after that, when the sons of God came into the daughters of men, and they bore children to them, mighty men of renown. Stop there, because every word of that verse matters. Sons of God, daughters of men, giants, mighty men of renown. Who exactly are those sons of God who took human wives and begot giants? This question has divided scholars for centuries, but one of the oldest interpretations points in a precise direction. Jewish rabbis before the Christian era, early church fathers, theologians of the first generations of Christianity, all of them identified those sons of God as angelic beings who abandoned their own domain and descended to the earth. It is not a peripheral or recent interpretation. It is the reading that predominated during the first centuries of the Judeo-Christian tradition, and the New Testament supports it directly in the book of Jude, verse 6, which says the following: "The angels who did not keep their proper domain, but left their own abode, are kept under darkness in eternal chains." The text does not describe them as metaphors. It describes them as real beings who crossed a line that should never have been crossed. Genesis gives the headline, but there is another text that fills in the details that Genesis deliberately omits. The Book of Enoch, attributed to Enoch, great-grandfather of Noah, the man that Genesis 5:24 describes as someone who walked with God. This text was cited directly in the New Testament, which indicates that the early church considered it a serious source. The Book of Enoch describes with extraordinary precision what happened before the flood. 200 angelic beings, whom the text calls the Watchers, descended to a mountain called Mount Hermon. Before acting, they made a pact among themselves, a pact of collective rebellion so that none could retract later. They swore to fulfill it together as a mutual guarantee that none would abandon what they were about to do. Then they approached human women, took wives, and from those unions was born an offspring that the text describes with terror. The children of the Watchers and the human women grew to an enormous size and a power that exceeded the natural. The Book of Enoch says that these giants consumed everything that humanity produced. They exhausted the resources of the earth, and when the food ran out, they turned against humanity itself, turning it into their food, an irreversible pact, a collective decision that would forever change the course of history and of all creation. The earth was transformed into a place of total violence, of limitless corruption, of unprecedented terror. Genesis 6:5 confirms it with a phrase that describes the magnitude of what happened. Then the Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intent of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. The Hebrew word to describe that state is complete, without nuances, without exceptions. The corruption was total. And here's where the question that most teachers and commentators never ask out loud appears. The Watchers took human wives. Those wives gave birth to giants, mighty men of renown. warriors of terrible power. But if sons were born, daughters were also born, and the text practically does not dedicate a single line to them. Genesis and the Book of Enoch concentrate almost all their attention on the masculine Nephilim, the warriors, the powerful. But what happened to the female Nephilim? To the daughters of the Watchers and the human women? The Book of Enoch describes in detail how these giants exhausted the earth's resources in a relatively short time. If the males became warriors of colossal size and supernatural power, what did they become? Keep that question, because it is exactly the thread that connects Genesis with the legends of the entire world. God contemplated what the earth had become and made a decision that would shake the foundations of creation. He was going to send a flood, not a local flood, nor a regional catastrophe, but a flood that would cover the entire earth. Only one man had remained righteous, only one lineage had not been contaminated by the corruption of the Watchers. Genesis 6:9 says that Noah was perfect in his generations, and many scholars interpret that phrase in a specific way, not only as a description of his moral character, but as a description of his genetic lineage intact by the Nephilim contamination. God commanded him to build the ark, and when the waters came, everything that walked on the earth was destroyed. The giants, the corrupt creatures, the Nephilim, the descendants of the Watchers, everything swept away by the waters of judgment. Or not? Because here's the question that opens a door that once opened cannot be easily closed. If the Nephilim were completely annihilated by the flood, why do Numbers 13:33 mention giants in Canaan? That was hundreds of years after the flood. In the time when Moses' spies explored the Promised Land, why does the Bible mention Goliath? A giant in the time of King David, centuries after the flood supposedly erased them. It is a question that the text seems to avoid deliberately, as if the authors knew the answer, but chose not to give it. And why did every ancient civilization that arose after the flood keep telling stories about semi-human beings? Something survived, or something was remembered with such intensity that it crossed oceans and generations without losing its essential form. Let us talk about the sirens, and before doing so, let us leave behind the image that cinema and children's stories have left us. Most know the sirens from Greek mythology, from Homer's Odyssey and the scene of Odysseus' ship. He is warned that his route will pass near an island inhabited by sirens, and that their song is different from any human music. It is not just beautiful, it is supernatural. Every sailor who hears it loses control of his will and steers the ship toward the music. The ships crash against the rocks and the men die, not by violence, but by an attraction they cannot resist. Odysseus orders his men to cover their ears with beeswax and orders that he be tied firmly to the mast of the ship. And the text says that even tied, even knowing what it was, the sound almost drove him to madness. Think about that description. A voice that annuls human will, a beauty that leads to destruction, a being that is not entirely human. From where does a culture extract an image like that? From pure imagination, or from something that was once real? Now there is something about the Greek sirens that most people are completely unaware of. The oldest representations of sirens in Greek art do not show them with a fishtail. That image arrived later. It is not just the beauty, it is the voice as a weapon, as a capture mechanism, as a power that surpasses reason and conscious will. The original sirens in Greek art were represented as women with bird features, with wings and claws. The constant in every representation, regardless of the era or cultural variation, was always the same: feminine. Their voice was their weapon, and that is precisely what we find in every corner of the world when we look for similar creatures. In West Africa there is a figure known as Mami Wata, whose name literally means mother water. She is described as extraordinarily beautiful, half woman and half fish or half serpent, according to local tradition. She has the power to captivate men, to drag them into the water and to hold them in a realm that does not belong to the ordinary world. The cult and mythology of Mami Wata are not a local legend. They span all of West Africa, Central Africa, and the African diaspora. It crossed oceans with the enslaved and settled in the Caribbean and South America with the same strength it had on the continent. In ancient Mesopotamia, exactly the same region where Genesis locates the first events of human history. In ancient Mesopotamia there were beings called the Apkallu, represented as half human, half fish. Messengers from before the flood. In ancient Babylon, the historian Berossus described a figure called Oans, a being with a fish body and human head. This being had arrived from the sea to teach knowledge to human beings, which resonates uncomfortably with the Book of Enoch, because the Book of Enoch explicitly states that the Watchers taught humans knowledge that should not have been revealed. In ancient Assyrian art, there are engravings of priests dressed in fish robes, dressed to look like hybrids of fish and human. The Rusalki of the Slavic tradition were dangerous water spirits that took the form of women of deadly beauty. The Ningyo of Japanese legend was described as a fish woman whose flesh granted immortality to whoever consumed it. The Selkies of the Irish and Scottish tradition could remove their sealskin and walk among humans as beautiful women. Each continent, each ocean, each ancient culture arrived at the same figure: feminine, supernatural, connected with water, dangerous. It is not an isolated African phenomenon. It is a constant that crosses continents and millennia with a consistency that is impossible to ignore. You have to stop and ask yourself seriously, how is it possible that cultures without any contact with each other coincide with such precision, not in general outlines, not in the vague idea of a woman of the sea, but in the concrete details of their nature and their power? Here is the theory that some researchers of ancient texts have proposed, and we will examine it with rigor before drawing conclusions. We know from Genesis and the Book of Enoch that angelic beings reproduced with human women before the flood. We know that from those unions were born the Nephilim, hybrid beings of a supernatural power that corrupted the entire earth. The Book of Enoch adds a detail that Genesis does not mention. The corruption was not limited to the human lineage. Chapter 7 of the Book of Enoch states that the Nephilim also corrupted the animals, the birds, the reptiles, and the fish. There was a generalized mixing that affected the entire natural world, not just the direct offspring of the Watchers. Then came the flood and covered the entire earth, and the earth was cleansed of everything that inhabited it. But water does not destroy what lives in the water. The flood did not reach the deepest places of the sea. Some researchers who study these texts from a biblical perspective ask a question that is difficult to dismiss. If there were Nephilim on the earth, is it possible that some form of corrupted hybrid beings ended up in the sea and survived? And here is where the thread connects with the question we left open at the beginning about the female Nephilim. The pattern that emerges from these cultures is not that of independent imagination. It is that of the shared memory of something real. Genesis and the Book of Enoch describe the male Nephilim as terrestrial warriors, powerful men of renown. But the traditions of the entire world situate these aquatic beings almost universally as feminine. Beautiful women with voices of a supernatural power, with an irresistible attraction toward mortal human men. Just as the Watchers, masculine angelic beings, were attracted by the daughters of men and took them, there could be a dark reflection here, an inversion of the same dynamic in the female lineage of that offspring. The masculine fallen angels were attracted by human women. They descended to the earth and begot a terrible offspring. And if the female Nephilim, carriers of that same supernatural nature, were attracted by the sons of men, attracting them, captivating them, dragging them toward the water and destruction, just as their fathers had done with human women. It is necessary to be completely honest at this point. The Bible does not state this directly nor with any other formulation. From the coasts of Scotland to the villages of Japan, from the temples of Babylon to the jungles of the Congo, the same figure, the scriptures do not contain any verse that says the female Nephilim became sirens. That does not exist in the text. What does exist is the record of total corruption before the flood, a corruption that affected the entire natural world, and the trail of that corruption, the echoes it left in the memory of every people that survived the flood, persists in mythology, because there is one more piece of this puzzle that appears directly in the biblical text and is usually ignored. Isaiah 13:21 and Isaiah 34:14 contain a Hebrew word that has puzzled translators for centuries. The word is Lilith in its plural form Liliot, and the translations differ radically on how to interpret it. Some versions translate it as owl, others as night creature, and some simply transliterate it without translating. But the Septuagint, the ancient Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, renders it with the Greek word onocentaurus, a hybrid creature. Isaiah 34 describes the total desolation of the land of Edom after the judgment of God and says that these creatures will dwell there. Ancient Jewish tradition developed an extensive tradition around a being called Lilith, a feminine supernatural being of dangerous power connected with the night, seduction, and death, characteristics that resonate with the sirens of the entire world. Similarly, the Hebrew word Tannin appears throughout the Old Testament and is translated as dragon or sea monster, and that point is fundamental. The judgment of the flood was total on the earth, but the sea remained out of the reach of the purifying waters. Job 41 offers the most detailed description of a creature called Leviathan, a sea being of terror that no human weapon can harm, that breathes fire, that lives in the depths of the sea, that God describes to Job as if it were a completely concrete reality. The ancient world had an understanding of what inhabited the deep places of the sea that we have completely lost, and the biblical writers wrote as people who took those realities with a seriousness that was not symbolic, but literal. Let us unite everything we have seen, because when we place it in order, the image that emerges is extraordinarily coherent. Before the flood, angelic beings called the Watchers descended to the earth and produced offspring with human women. That offspring were the Nephilim, beings of supernatural power that corrupted the human lineage and the entire natural world. The corruption was total and absolute, and God responded by sending the flood to cleanse the earth of what it had become. The symmetry is disturbing. The masculine angels came down attracted by women, and if the female ones went up attracted by men. But the flood covered the earth, not the bottom of the sea, and the memories of what existed before crossed the water with the survivors. Each civilization that arose afterward carried those memories transformed into myths, but preserving the essence of what they remembered. stories of semi-human beings connected with water, of a supernatural beauty with voices of a power that annulled the will. The Greeks called them sirens. West Africa knew them as mami wata. Babylon sculpted them on walls and porticos. Japan recorded them in ancient texts. Ireland and Scotland whispered them on cold nights near the sea. These stories are too consistent, too specific, too universal to be a product of independent imagination. They are distorted memories of beings that once existed, the echo of an antediluvian world that God destroyed. But the absence of a direct statement does not equate to the absence of evidence, and the accumulated evidence is difficult to discard. A world that humanity could never completely forget, that kept returning in every culture under different but recognizable forms. And there is one last piece that connects all this with the end of history, not only with the beginning. Revelation 21:1 says something that few readers stop to examine. In the new creation, the sea was no more. Of all the things that John could have mentioned, of all the elements that disappear in the new creation, no more death, no more pain, no more tears, and among all those promises, he says specifically, no more sea. Why would it be necessary to eliminate the sea in the new creation? Why mention it among the great promises of the end of history? Some theologians believe that the sea in biblical literature represents chaos and the domain of supernatural darkness. It is a word that modern translators often soften or avoid, but which in the original Hebrew has an unmistakable weight. The deep, the abyss, the place where things that God has not yet judged in a definitive and complete manner dwell. And that is true. If the sea has a spiritual meaning that goes back to the corruption before the flood, then the elimination of the sea in the new creation would not only be a geographic or climatic change, it would be the final closing of a door that has remained open since the days of Noah, since the Watchers, since the Nephilim, the Sirens, Mami Wata, the Rusalki, the Ningyo, the water spirits of 100 distinct cultures. Everything finally sealed and closed forever, and the sea was no more in any form or in any place. The Nephilim continue to be one of the deepest mysteries of all the Bible, and the more you delve into it, the more the horizon expands. What God destroyed in the flood was not only a generation of corrupt beings, it was a complete version of this world. It is not a poetic metaphor. The text describes their scales, their breath, their dwelling in the depths with the precision of a witness. A version so far removed from the original design of creation that it had to be washed away to the bottom and started over. And yet, the memory of them survived, transmitted from generation to generation, carried across the oceans, told in 1,000 different languages by 1,000 distinct peoples who did not know each other and who all arrived at the same description. Beautiful, supernatural, feminine, connected with water, immortal to the men who could not resist their call. If this mystery has made you see Genesis with different eyes, subscribe, because there are many more waiting for you on this channel. John writes from exile in Patmos at the end of the 1st century, and that phrase about the sea has intrigued theologians ever since. What separates a myth from a memory is the specificity, and the specificity of these descriptions has no simple explanation. And what is most impressive about that coherence is that it was not built by a single author, but by thousands of voices separated by centuries.